evening. Good evening. I'm Beth Gaulle, and as chair of the Howard Wooden Lecture Series, and on behalf of the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, I would like to thank you all for attending this evening. And before Patricia introduces our speaker, I'd like to give you just a little background on the lecture series. All of the Howard Wooden lectures are made possible by the members of this Friends group, which established our endowment fund. It started back in 1985 when Howard Wooden, the director of the Wichita Art Museum at the time, suggested to the Friends group that an endowment fund could be developed as part of the Art Museum's 50th anniversary celebration. In 1997, the endowment for the exhibitions and acquisition of art was established, as well as the library fund. Then 3 years later, the Howard Wooden Lecture Series was created to fund lectures at the Wichita Art Museum with the caveat that the lectures would all be free and open to the public. Now, all of the Friends endowments are managed by the Wichita Community Foundation. Over the years, these endowment funds have grown from $234,000 to just over $3 million. We have given the museum over $2 million to date for art acquisitions, materials for the library, and to make these educational lectures available for free. And now, Dr. Patricia McDonald, the director of our Wichita Art Museum, will do the honors in presenting to you our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you who are standing in the back for patience and indulgence. Who knew that Monet de Matisse and Mary Cassatt were going to be so popular at a spring evening? I think it's the temperatures this evening that has you all coming out. So lovely to greet you on a spring evening. And also lovely to greet you on behalf of the Wichita Art Museum, but really on the behalf of the wonderful Friends of WAM. There's scarcely a thing that we pull off here without their moral support and enthusiasm and help with financial support for this lecture series. And I love that many years ago, the Friends determined to honor a former director by naming a lecture series after him. So Howard Wooden, you heard here from 1975 to 1989, he was in charge and oversaw the expansion, the Edward Larrabee Barnes expansion of our building. There was a strong expansion of the art collection that happened under his tenure. And I know that people still talk about Howard with real affection in the community. So it's just lovely that twice a year we have the Howard Wooden Lecture and remember everything that he did for the Art Museum. We welcome a quite distinguished speaker to Wichita this evening, Dr. Kimberly Jones. She is the curator of 19th century French art from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. But before I proceed to introduce Dr. Jones, I need to share some information about all the extraordinary people who helped us with support for our Monet de Matisse exhibition. The projects like this need wonderful guardian angels to help bring such world masterpieces to Wichita. And maybe also to acknowledge, since we did this show, we really wanted to extend the opportunity for learning. And as you come, I hope you have also visited the French fashion prints in the savoir-faire exhibition, and also treasures from our own collection that we called Americans in Paris. So Paris was the center of the 19th century art world, and before that only changed with the Second World War. And of course, if you were American and an artist of any ambition, you needed to get yourself to France and you needed to get yourself to Paris. That was true for the Germans and the Spanish and the Italians. But we have real treasures in our own permanent collection that reflects that phenomenon. So with this exhibition, Monet de Matisse, we attracted amazingly generous sponsorship. The exhibition was underwritten by lead sponsors Paula and Barry Downing. The Latner Family Foundation provided additional major underwriting. Mickey Armstrong, Judy Slauson, the DeVore Foundation, Dr. Dennis and Ann Ross, Sandra Lengel, and Charles Baker are our principal sponsors for the show. The Trust Company of Kansas, Emprise Bank, and Fred and Mary Koch Foundation are substantial corporate and foundation sponsors. You're going to have to bear with me because this list goes on a bit. Generous private support has been provided by Patty and Bill Bennett, Louise Barron, the Berry Foundation, Mary Eves, Norma Griever, Helen and Ed Healy, Dr. and Mrs. Gianquicha, Mike and Dee Michaelis, Sarah Smith, Martin Pringle, attorneys at law, Anna Martin Bauer, Nancy and John Bramer, Doug Brem, Donna Bunk, Vicki Cady, Ann Coffin, Karen and John Hageman, Jeff Kennedy and Patty Gorham, Georgia and Keith Stevens, Sue and Kurt Watson, Alice and Dale Wiggins, James Boyd, and Glenn and Marion Misko were also underwriters for the exhibition. And not to forget our standard bearers. You heard before, the Friends of the Art Museum have a specific endowment fund to help with exhibitions. Of course, they too help to support this. I'd really ask for your applause because a good number of the names I just mentioned are in the room this evening. And we have a new corporate sponsor. UMB Bank helped us with support for the Americans in Paris exhibition. It was really our new board member, Gil Trout, who heads UMB here in Wichita, helped us with that sponsorship. So applause to UMB Bank, and if you know Gil Trout, please tell him we really appreciate the underwriting. So. Dr. Kimberly Jones has a sterling background and a perfect as a speaker in conjunction with this exhibition and our own collection. She has a master's and a PhD from the University of Maryland with a concentration in 19th century French topics. She landed fellowships at the Musée National du Chateau in Pau. That's a town in France near Lourdes, so it's by the Spanish border, as well as a fellowship at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. That's really the temple of the French Impressionist collection in Paris. She arrived at the National Gallery of Art as an assistant curator for French paintings in 1995, and they have been promoting her ever since. She's now specialized in French and 19th century in the scope of her work at the National Gallery. She's a great Degas scholar with a 1996 show on Degas at the races, and she shared with us she was presently working on a show that will open in fall next year of Degas at the Opera, so we can all go off and see her good work. She's also worked on exhibitions of the Impressionist Frederic Bazille and the French Nabi painter Edouard Viard. In 2008, just another exhibition of note, she did a show on both paintings and photographs for artists in the Forest of Fontainebleau, so that would have been the Barbizon Circle of Artists. And in 1914, she organized for the National Gallery the exhibition Degas and Cassatt, so Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt. And for the catalog, there were two articles that she helped craft, but she contributed the essay on Degas portraits of Cassatt. So we thought she was ideal to come and tell us about our own painting. I'm really eager to have her share with us insights on a very daring woman as well as an extraordinary artist, so that we gain insights and perspective on our own really world-class Cassatt painting. And as you can well imagine, a scholar at this level has a resume that goes on for pages and pages and pages, so I could say more about this bright mind, but I will stop here and ask you to help me to welcome Dr. Jones to Wichita and the podium.
Well, first of all, thank you, Patricia, for that lovely introduction and also for the invitation. This is my very first visit to Wichita, And someone asked me earlier, have you ever been to Kansas before? And I said, well, the problem now is you set the bar so high, I can't imagine that any visit to anywhere else in Kansas could ever compare. So thank you for the warm visit, welcome that I've received. It's such a lovely, lovely place and a beautiful museum. You are very fortunate to have it, and I'm so delighted to be here. And I'm so delighted to talk about one of my very favorite artists, Mary Cassatt. The timing of this exhibition could not be, and this lecture is more appropriate, because right now Mary Cassatt is having a bit of a moment in Paris. Last month, the Musée Jacques-André in Paris opened a wonderful retrospective, which I actually was very fortunate I got to see in Paris a couple of weeks ago. What's interesting about this exhibition is the very first retrospective devoted to Mary Cassatt since 1893. Yes, that was exactly when the curator, Nancy Matthews, contacted me and said, we're doing this exhibition and I want loans. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. There's not been a Mary Cassatt show in Paris since then. But it says something about Mary Cassatt's rather complicated position amongst the Impressionists, that she sort of occupies this very unique place because she's American and she's a woman. So she wasn't really as much of a part of the center. And so she's not as familiar. She's not as well represented. Partly this is due to her dealer, Durand Ruel, who largely marketed her to American collectors. And she was collected quite heavily by Americans, much to the continuing frustration of Mary Cassatt, who actually berated Durand Ruel for not promoting her more heavily in France. And in fact, ultimately, she left him for the dealer Ambroise Vollard because she felt that she wasn't getting that representation. And it's had a long-term effect because although she's very well known in America, very well represented across the country, outside the American borders, she is virtually unknown. I was actually telling an anecdote last night to Patricia and Tara that a couple of years ago I was in Copenhagen and there was a little lovely exhibition of Mary Cassatt prints, and they described her as the American Anna Anker. Because Anna Anker is a well-known woman, Danish artist, who did paintings of domestic scenes. But in Copenhagen, in Denmark, no one has ever heard of Mary Cassatt. They know Anna Anker, that was the point of reference. And I thought that was really interesting because it really drives home the fact that here is an artist who hasn't gotten her due outside of her birth country. Even though she spent the last 50 years of her life in France, she is buried in France, she has the Legion of Honor, she exhibited with the French Impressionists. So she's still awaiting her really big, star turn. This is a start, and of course I love that the painting they chose is my painting, my baby, the little girl in the blue armchair. And she's everywhere in Paris. You see her on the fronts of buses. You see this enormous poster in the exhibition. And the exhibition, apparently, the curator told me, is doing very, very well, very good attendance. People are really loving it, and it's wonderful, but it's just the first step. Happily, we are in America, so we have wonderful opportunities again and again to see the great works of Mary Cassatt. I just wanted to show this. I love this caricature, which came out at the time of my exhibition. What's wonderful about Mary Cassatt, what makes her so special, is she brings such authenticity and sincerity to her art. She's known as the painter of mothers and children. She's known for these domestic subjects. But she has such acuity. She brings such a keen observer's eye that she captures the real essence, the psychology, the personality. Many artists would fall into sentimentality, into cloying sweetness, but she paints real children, real families. They feel like real people. And so her little girl in the blue armchair, she captures that sort of ennui, that sort of boredom and annoyance of a tired child who's literally just sort of flopped herself in the chair, exhausted after running around. It feels like an actual moment in time, something really observed rather than something that was posed and orchestrated. And that's why I think her art resonates so much with us today, because people see that. They've seen it in their own children and their nephews and nieces and children they see in the park and at the mall. That reality speaks to us. And she understood that so intimately and so well. Now, Mary Cassatt was an extraordinary figure. She was born in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, which is actually now part of Pittsburgh, in May of 1955. She came from very favorable background. Her father was a stockbroker. Her mother came from a banking family. So she came from an upper middle class family, very well-to-do, very well established. The family had an environment where they promoted education and travel. By the time she was 10, she'd already visited most of the European capitals. She'd been to London and Paris and Berlin. So very continental, very sophisticated. And shortly before her 16th birthday, she enrolled in a drawing class at the illustrious Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which accounts among its most famous alumni, Thomas Eakins, who I'm sure you all know, a lovely painting by him upstairs. But this marked the beginning of an uphill battle. Cassatt's family didn't really encourage her to be an artist. She was born at a time when she had 3 strikes against her: her gender, her nationality, and her class. Everything said, no, 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 art is not for you. You were supposed to get married and have children. And at that time, women artists were seen as nothing but amateurs and dabblers. You could sort of paint decorative fans and pretty little still lifes and little watercolors, but be a professional artist was virtually unheard of. She grew very frustrated the training at the Pennsylvania Academy. Not surprisingly, she found it patronizing. She found the pace slow. She didn't particularly like the male instructors who were dismissive. Her fellow students were arrogant. And so she hatched a plan, and she wanted to study the old masters on her own. So through much cajoling, she finally convinced her parents, very difficult, in 1866, to allow her to go to Paris. Now, this was a real challenge because her family was very strongly opposed to this. In fact, her father actually declared he would rather see his daughter dead than living abroad as a bohemian. fairly determined, but she was determined. She had to go to Paris to study. And that wasn't just hyperbole. You have to remember, in 1866, there were no art museums in America. You couldn't see art. You certainly couldn't see the old masters. There were private collections, yes. And if you had the connections and the wherewithal, you could visit them. But the Metropolitan Museum was still 4 years off. So if you wanted to see great art, you had to go to Europe. You had to be there to experience this. So she finally, convinces her parents to let her go. And she enrolls in the studio of Charles Chaplin. And keep in mind, this time also there were limited options for training for women. The École des Beaux-Arts did not accept female students. You had to enroll in one of the private studios, and so Charles Chaplin was one of them. Chaplin was known, he was a very successful artist, painting of genre scenes, these sort of sweet, cloying sorts of subjects. I'm showing you one of his paintings here on the left. Very typical of what he did. Very popular, very successful, but not terribly exciting. On the right, I'm showing you, this is a photograph, and actually I did put the arrow in, that's good of me. There's Mary Cassatt among the students. She spent a little time with Charles Chaplin. She actually also passed briefly through the studios of Jean-Léon Gérôme and Thomas Couture. She's essentially soaking up everything she can, but she spent most of her time in the Louvre, studying the old masters, making copies, and that was very important for her, that recognition that was the real training ground, was learning directly from the old masters themselves. But she was ambitious, she was driven, and in 1869 she submits her first painting to the Paris Salon. It is rejected, keeping in mind that in the 19th century, the Paris Salon, the annual art exhibition, was the only place to exhibit. If you wanted to be an artist, you had any ambitions, if you wanted to succeed, you need to see and be seen at the Salon. And the juries were notoriously conservative. They were also very insular and controlled. Basically, the jurors were usually the professors, and so they would favor their students. And so it was a whole sort of complicated old boys system that was very hard to break into, very intolerant of anything that was new and different. And of course, Mary Cassatt basically, she checked all the boxes for things they didn't like. So, and this will set the tone. Now, in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, and she's forced to return to the United States because of the outbreak of the war. And she immediately, all the freedom she had, gone. It was very frustrating going back home and living in the outskirts of Philadelphia where her family was living. Not only did she have trouble finding proper supplies, her father refused to pay for anything. If she was going to be an artist, all right, you're going to do it on your terms. So in fact, she tried to sell some paintings in New York, but to no avail. She then sent 2 paintings to Chicago, hoping to sell them. Well, they were burned up in the Great Fire in 1871. She could not catch a break. But finally, a stroke of luck, a local cardinal commissioned her to make copies of 2 Correggio paintings in Parma, and he agreed to pay her way to go to Europe. So she travels in December of 1871 with a fellow artist by the name of Emily Sartain, another female artist, and they landed in Liverpool and then proceeded to travel. They passed through London and Paris and ultimately headed on to Parma. And that's really where her artistic career really begins to take off. She paints this work during the carnival. She shows in the Paris Salon. It actually gets accepted, completely ignored, but it does get acquired by a private collector in America. So this is a good start. This is a new page for her. She's very excited, but it's very much a hit and miss. She also then travels on to Spain. She spends 6 months beginning in October of 1872 in Spain, in Madrid, and then Seville, absorbing the culture, experiencing the art, studying the works, particularly of Velázquez and all the great Spanish masters, Murillo. This really becomes very important to her, that sort of the lushness of the paint palette, the richness, the sensuality that underlies all of it really does sort of infuse her art. And she creates these beautiful Spanish paintings. The one on the right, actually, the bullfighter and the young woman was actually shown in the Paris Salon of 1873. So again, she's starting to build ground. This love of Spanish art was not unique to Mary Cassatt. There was very much this sort of whole Hibernate trend going on. Obviously, Edouard Manet was a great exemplar of this, and she was a great admirer of Manet. She had certainly seen his painting of the Matador, which Manet exhibited in his own private exhibition at the World's Fair in 1867, which she would have seen. And certainly Manet was one of the titans in the avant-garde art world, and his work was well known. But still, she struggled. She traveled a great deal. In 1873, she spent the next year traveling around. She went to Paris, she went to The Hague, she went to Antwerp, she went back to Parma and Rome, soaking up the old masters. And then finally, in June of 1874, she settles definitively in Paris. And apart from occasional travels elsewhere, a few visits back home, Paris is where she will stay for the next 52 years. So she settles in Paris and she becomes, a true expatriate, a true French woman. Now, in 1874, she has a stroke of luck, although she doesn't know it at the time. She exhibits the painting on the left. Well, I should say that both of these paintings are exhibited. The one on the right is shown at a gallery on the Boulevard Haussmann, which is very nice. But the one on the left is more important, Ida, because she shows it in the Paris Salon in 1874. And the story is that a printmaker by the name of Gabrielle Tournay, that Mary Cassatt had met in her travels in Antwerp, is walking through the salon with his friend Edgar Degas. And he points out this painting to him, says that I met this young artist. And Degas sees this painting, and the story that Cassatt's biographer tells, Achille Segaud, and one takes everything Segaud says with a little grain of salt. As early biographers, you always have to be very cautious, but Degas purportedly remarked, "That is true. There is someone who feels as I do." Whether or not he said that, you could certainly question it. It's very interesting that he says someone who feels as I do, this shared sensibility. But I think there is certainly a grain of truth to that. In a letter that Degas writes to his friend, the Vicomte Lepic, not too long after that, he describes Cassatt as this distinguished person whose friendship I honor, as you would in my place. So those are Degas' own words. We certainly reinforce that notion that Cassatt was someone he respected. Cassatt was a genuine friend. And Degas, well, he's not the easiest of people. There's always been this question, was Degas a misogynist? Did he dislike women? And I've always been of the belief that no, Degas was simply a misanthrope. He hated everyone. He was an equal opportunity. He was not an easy person. He did not make friends easily. He was acerbic, he was caustic, he would lash out at his friends, but he had a genuine and long-standing relationship with Mary Cassatt, and he did respect her, and that was the highest praise. And he would oftentimes make very cutting remarks, and I will mention a few of them as we proceed. And again, with Degas, you sort of knew that that was the kind of person he was. He was a difficult personality, but he was loyal. For whatever he might say, whatever cutting comments he might make, if you were his friend, if he respected you, he did respect you. And there were people that he did not respect, and there were a lot of them. Now, meanwhile, Cassatt feels the same way. Again, the problem is we have no correspondence between the two of them. Degas pretty much destroyed all of his correspondence with Cassatt, and Cassatt destroyed most of her correspondence as well. So there's a lot of little bits and pieces that we don't know, so we sort of have to fill it in based upon the bits and pieces we do, and a lot of it comes from secondhand accounts. Cassatt actually tells her friend Louisine Havemeyer, who was a great friend of hers, she recounted a story that in 1874, she saw a group of pastels by Degas in a shop window. The first sight of Degas' pictures was the turning point of my artistic life. I used to go and flatten my nose against that window and absorb all I could of his art. It changed my life. I saw art then as I wanted to see it. So this was a really important moment, and she always acknowledged that Degas was a tremendous influence, that his art was revelatory for her. What's curious is that they actually didn't meet for quite some time, which I find very interesting because around this time, 1874-75, Cassatt was renting an apartment and studio on the Rue Laval, now the Rue Victor Massé, right near the Boulevard de Clichy and the Place Pigalle. Degas had a studio at 4 Rue Fauchet. They literally were living 5 minutes apart, walking distance. They easily could have passed each other on the street, for all we know, but they don't seem to have met. Louisine Havemeyer, who is, I think, probably the most reliable observer. I mean, she was very close. She was Cassatt's closest friend, and she knew Degas quite well. She thought they met probably around 1874-75. I think most of us now think that is unlikely, that it was probably closer to 1877. The reason we think that was when Degas does finally meet Cassatt, he invites her to exhibit with the Impressionists. And there was an Impressionist show in 1876 and 1877. So had they met earlier, she probably would have been brought into the fold earlier. And there was supposed to be a show in 78, which did not take place. So it's probably around 77 they finally had their formal introduction. They probably just kept sort of circling around. And you have to keep in mind, in the 19th century, particularly for Mary Cassatt, there were ways you didn't just sort of walk up to someone on the street and say hi, or knock on their studio and say, hey, here I am. It had to go through channels. You had to sort of be introduced. I mean, it was just, there was that level of propriety, which is very, very important, particularly dealing with Mary Cassatt, who was a woman of a certain class. She was a lady. And there were certain behaviors that would have been unseemly, that she wouldn't have been able to sort of make that leap. Now, Cassatt, of course, has this tremendous relationship with Degas, and he was truly inspirational, and he did, as she said, changed her life. They were very close friends. She sat for him on a number of occasions. He did this wonderful portrait on the left. I was telling the anecdote, very interesting story. This painting hung in Mary Cassatt's studio for decades. And around 1906, she writes to her dealer, Ambrose Vollard, and she started to actually cull her collection. She's thinking long term. She talks about burning works of art and destroying things. This may be when she's sort of crafting her legacy, very carefully, which is actually in some ways very smart. You don't want people seeing really bad art after you die, or things that are embarrassing. It's unfortunate because you don't know what she may or may not have destroyed. We don't know that she burned any art. She just threatened to do this. But she says she wants to sell this painting because she finds it kind of embarrassing now, and she finds it very awkward. And she wants it sold, but she doesn't want her name attached to it. She doesn't want people knowing that she posed for it. And of course, the irony is, over time, it eventually finds its way into the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, and there it is, Mary Cassatt in big letters, which is a cautionary tale to all of you, by the way, of the dangers and difficulties of maintaining your own legacy. Once you're out of the picture, all bets are off. And I find this story very curious because it was hanging in her studio where people were coming and going. People for decades had seen this painting. I've always been of the belief that it wasn't so much that she found it a bad painting. I mean, she thought it was a very good painting, but rather that this is Mary Cassatt in the bloom of youth, that first excitement of being with the Impressionists when she's young and bold and adventurous. And as she becomes older, she becomes increasingly conservative, little, as we all sort of do. Let's be honest. We all, we oftentimes regret those picadillos of youth, the things that you do when you're wild and crazy and young. When you get older, sometimes you begin to sort of, I don't want the kids knowing I did that sort of thing. So I think she just didn't want to go into her family, and she didn't want that attachment, but there you are. This will always be the point. Look at her. I mean, she's leaning forward. She's got her elbows on her knees. I mean, how unladylike you could possibly be. So in some ways, old, mature Mary Cassatt in her 60s is beginning to be a little embarrassed by her younger self, as I think we can all sort of relate to that. That mullet in high school seemed like a really good idea, but later on one does regret it. And she was very careful about how she spoke of her relationship with Degas. I mean, she talked about him as a colleague and a friend, but she was very coy about acknowledging that she posed. She said, I posed for him on occasion when he needed a position. There's a lot of paintings. I mean, as I said, I did a whole essay on this. I had a whole room in my exhibition, in fact, of images that he did of Mary Cassatt. So it wasn't just on occasion. She posed a lot, but she didn't want to be reduced to being a muse and a model and, dare I say it, presumed mistress. She wanted to be seen as an artist. She wanted to be taken seriously. And so she downplayed that aspect so that people wouldn't get the wrong ideas or begin to diminish her and sort of just start making unflattering assumptions. Now, it was thanks to Degas that, of course, Mary Cassatt enters the fold of the Impressionists. She makes her debut in 1879 in the Fourth Impressionist exhibition, which is an exhibition actually Degas largely managed and organized. She exhibited a total of 12 works. There's 11 listed in the catalogue, and a 12th that was exhibited hors catalogue, outside of catalogue, as we like to say. The images she shows are really quite extraordinary. There she is. There's my baby, my beautiful painting. We know a fair amount about this painting. In a letter to her dealer Vollard, she talks about it. We know that the little girl is the daughter of friends of Monsieur Degas. And although she doesn't actually name him, this lovely little puppy here, this little Belgian Griffon dog, must certainly be Baptiste, Mary Cassatt's own dog, which was acquired for her by Degas, who acquired it. His friend Lepic apparently raised Belgian Griffon dogs, as one does. And so he writes to him and says, I would like to acquire a dog on behalf of my very good friend, Mary Cassatt. So Degas is all over this painting. And of course, in the letter, she also says, she talks about she'd done the painting in 1878, and she'd submitted it to the World's Fair, and it was rejected, which made her very upset because Degas had admired it so much. And Degas even worked on the background and underlines this. And we figure through technical study that what he probably did was this little corner. Now that you laugh, but it's a very small thing, but it really does shift the whole space. And I think it's very telling that he didn't take over, that he literally just seemed to have given her a note, well, try this corner. It will open up the space. It'll give you this diagonal. And of course, then she had to sort of make everything work. And the chairs are really odd. I mean, it looks like bumper cars in the middle of this Parisian apartment. But it says a great deal that she acknowledged that he had worked on this and that she gave him credit for this. But what he did was very minimal because she didn't need a lot. He was just literally a colleague saying, hey, try this. I think this will work, and it did. I think the best part of the letter, which sometimes gets left out, she was particularly enraged because the jury reviewing works that were submitted that year consisted of 3 men, and one of them was a pharmacist. And apparently, I guess pharmacists are not known for their knowledge of the fine arts. But she salvaged the moment and exhibited it in 1879. And of course, now it's one of the great treasures of the National Gallery of Art and is everywhere in Paris at the moment. But most of the works that she exhibited were scenes of modern life, particularly scenes of opera and theater. This was a subject that, of course, was very common among the Impressionists. And she was fascinated by the setting, by the illumination, and focusing on these depictions of women. So the paintings that she showed that year, Mary Cassatt was actually one of the best received of all the artists that year. She was widely, for the most part, very highly praised, very well respected. She did something very novel. These two paintings actually she exhibited in painted colored frames. The painting on the left apparently had sort of a green, sort of pea green frame, and the one on the right had a red frame, so she's playing complementary colors. One critic said that was very bold and interesting, and another said they're absolutely hideous. So can't please everyone, but they were bold images. And you notice, for example, she oftentimes will play with reflection. So she makes very complicated visual space. Two more of the images she showed that year, once again, these wonderful mirrors, focusing on the women themselves. They are the subjects, and yet they are not engaging with us. They are looking out in the world, they are engaging their environment. How different that is from what other Impressionist artists are doing. I'm showing you an Eva Gonzalez on the left, which is roughly contemporary, Alberto Morisot. Here you see the women in the opera box, and the women are subjects. They are on display. It's about their beauty, it's about their accoutrements, their beautiful clothes, their beautiful fans. They are objects presented for our pleasure, for our visual experience. It's all about, they have become objects, not people. Cassatt, however, never loses track of the fact that these are real people. Renoir, again, this beautiful painting of the Loge. Wonderful, but it's all about this pretty woman and who's been put on display for our pleasure. Cassatt, however, her woman doesn't even notice us. She doesn't care. She doesn't invite us into her world. She, in fact, is looking at the stage. Of course, what is also happening is we have this man here. So he's watching her while she's like, I'm trying to watch the play. I don't know what your problem is. But that's the complexity. And as a woman, she understood. She knew that when you went to the opera, particularly as a woman, you were on display. It very much was kind of the marriage mart for young women. You would go and you would be there with your mother and you'd be in your box and men would be eyeing you up and they would come during, the break, the entr'acte, but you were very much there. It was a meat market in many ways. And men don't think about that, but the women did. And I think Cassatt, she knew exactly what happened when you went there. You were putting yourself out there. You were putting yourself on display to be seen. And yet she almost always limits our access or makes it very clear that you might be looking at me, but I don't care. I'm doing my own thing. We have a woman in profile, and notice how her fan just covers part of her face. She's looking away, she's absorbed in her own world, and she's probably aware that she's being viewed, but she is not going to encourage you. She's not going to invite you into your world. You can do what you want, but she is going to do what she wants. And how different that is from what Degas does. Here the woman doesn't even have a face. She doesn't even exist. She is literally broken down to nothing but a hand with her lorgnette and the fan. It's all about the opera singers on the dancers on stage. So we, in fact, are probably her male companion who's not even paying attention to her. We're too busy watching the dancers on stage. So Cassatt and Degas both are playing with our perceptions and how we experience the world. But Cassatt, as a woman, I think brings an understanding that male counterparts don't necessarily truly understand because they've never been on the receiving end of that particular gaze. Now, the 1879 exhibition actually was surprisingly successful. The artists turned a profit, which isn't always the case, not because they sold art per se, but because they sold tickets. Because here's the beauty of it. People were curious about the Impressionists. Some people came because they loved art and they wanted to see it. Some were curious, some wanted to come to mock, but they had to pay for the privilege. So they actually did make a little bit of a profit. It was a very successful exhibition, and Cassatt in particular and Degas both had gotten very good critical marks. High on this success, Degas proposes a new project, a very ambitious and unusual project, a project of prints. That was going to be a print journal called Le Jour et la Nuit, Day and Night, and it was going to be composed of, as the title would suggest, black and white imagery, black and white prints. original artistic prints by the Impressionists. There's only one problem. Apart from Bracquemond and Degas, none of them were printmakers. None of them even knew the basics of printmaking. I mean, it's a great idea, but Degas, had this amazing ability to sort of energize people, and Cassatt particularly, could see his vision. So they undertake these extraordinary prints, and they spend most of 1880, working on printmaking. And so Cassatt basically dives into this world where she has never worked before. She's never done a print in her life, and begins to make prints, these beautiful soft ground etchings. And I'm showing you 2 states of the print that she planned to publish in the opera box, an early print, which is really wonderful because you don't even have the face of the woman right there. And then this beautiful final, and you can see it's very close and subject, obviously, to the painting that she had done. So she's sort of working on subject matter she knows. This is a truly extraordinary thing. As I said, she knows nothing about printmaking. Printmaking is really dirty work. It's messy. I mean, the ink gets everywhere if you've ever done any printmaking. And she just throws herself into it. I mean, I have such admiration for what she does. And she does, not only these prints, she's doing a whole series of prints. And a lot of them are one-offs, a single impression, or just 1 or 2, playing around, very experimental. I mean, they are extraordinary works. Now, the journal is never published. Mary Cassatt's mother, who was not a big fan of Edgar Degas, I feel I should say, put the blame squarely on him, said he never finishes anything. This is true. And it was his fault that it didn't get published, probably also true. But she also said that she regrets that Mary wasted so much of her time on printmaking when she should have been doing paintings. And there I will respectfully disagree, because Mary Cassatt discovered that she had an extraordinary gift for printmaking. She was incredibly adept, very inventive, very innovative, and printmaking will continue to be a major part of her artistic career for the rest of her life. Degas stops doing soft ground etchings at this point, and basically this is 1880 is the end. He does monotypes, he'll continue to do some lithographs, but he gets bored with that. But Cassatt finds a new calling and finds a new way of creating art that she becomes very passionate about and will be very important. And Cassatt did dabble. As I said, she was remarkably experimental. That was one of my great discoveries when I worked on my exhibition, was how adventurous she was. She would try anything. And it's really remarkable to see how she would throw herself into something new, try new materials. She'd worked in distemper and metallic paint, pastel and etching and lithography. She was game for anything. I mean, it's really remarkable to see that willingness to engage in everything. And some things worked better than others. I mean, she only did this one lithograph, which is a shame because it's really beautiful. And lithograph is essentially, you work with a stone and you work with the property that oil and water basically repel one another. And so you basically draw with a waxy crayon, like a drawing, then you apply a layer of water, and then you apply the ink. The ink will be repelled by the water and will stick to the waxy crayon, and then you just run it through a press. So it's literally a drawn print. It's as close to drawing as you can get. But she wasn't, this is an interesting thing, Cassatt was not a great draftswoman. In fact, she said one of the reasons she undertook printmaking was to teach herself the discipline of drawing. So Degas is one of the greatest draftsmen of all time, but Cassatt was a painter. And so drawing was not something that she felt a natural affinity to. So I think that's why she didn't do it. And I'm sorry that she didn't push herself more in that regard. Now, by 1878, Cassatt has been joined in Paris by her parents and her sister Lydia. Her father is still adamant that, is paying for the residence, but she's got to make her own way as an artist. He's not giving her money to support herself. She has to find the wherewithal to support herself as an artist. And at the same time, she's also will eventually be caring. Her sister Lydia suffered from Bright's disease and tragically dies in 1882. It's basically kidney failure. And her parents were getting up in years, so will eventually also become their caretakers while also having an artistic career. So Monet never had a challenge like that. Let me just say that up front. But she continues to create. And she uses her family and the world around her as her inspiration. This is just one of many paintings that she does of her sister Lydia sitting in a garden. And these are extraordinarily beautiful paintings. I don't have to tell you, you have one of the greatest Cassatts here in Wichita. What an extraordinarily talented artist she was, her facility with paint. And again, that subtlety. She's showing Lydia from behind. It's not about her identity, and showing her as she is sort of seated in the garden with the dog on her lap, working with some sort of needlework, keeping herself occupied. And so it's really about the observation of the light and the beautiful brushwork. But this is classic Impressionism in every sense of the word. The subject matter is one that all of the Impressionists explored, from Morisot to Monet to Manet. What's interesting is even though Cassatt I shouldn't say Cassatt identified, let me correct myself. Even though we're pretty certain it's Lydia because she was her regular model, it's not about Lydia. It's about a figure. It's not a portrait. It's not intended to be a portrait. The actual identity of the sitter is not important in this. It's really about capturing the figure in that environment out of doors. And she really focuses now increasingly on, she's finding her stride, domestic subjects. Now, there's a very good reason for this, in that as a woman, there were limitations placed upon her where she could go. She could not go to the café concert and the cabarets. She couldn't hang around backstage at the opera like Monet and Renoir and Degas did. That was not appropriate. That was not seemly. That was not acceptable. So in some ways, she was limited to a woman's domain. But rather than being limited by that, she uses that for inspiration and creates these extraordinarily sensitive and, again, keenly observed images of a woman sitting drinking tea. You get a sense, again, that personality, the physicality. These feel like real people. The way she holds her cup, the way she slouches slightly in her chair. It's so beautifully observed, it's so beautifully rendered. Just those subtle elements of the life that women lived. And in all of these paintings, you get a sense she's using her own life, her own apartment. This is, in fact, for example, I want you to pay attention to this this little couch. I apologize, this slide is slightly yellow. I should have a better image. And the gilded wall. This is actually a fan by Edgar Degas that was in Mary Cassatt's collection. It was a gift to her. But this is a visitor coming into her apartment, into her own space. And a rare image, this wonderful painting from the National Gallery's collection. There's little Baptiste again, a little older now. A rare example where you get a sense of the inside and outside. Many of these images feel very cloistered. They feel very walled off. So this is a very unusual image because you do get a sense that she's sitting on the balcony and you get that view outside. But many of the images feel very enclosed. They feel very much like interior spaces, even when they're in gardens. Her family would remain her primary subject. On the left is a wonderful portrait that she did of her brother Alexander and her nephew Robert Kelso Cassatt in 1884, painted actually during a visit they made to Paris. And you will note this rather ugly floral couch and the gilded walls in the back. So this is the Cassatt family portrait. Alexander is just an aside, interesting figure. He was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Very, very important, very distinguished figure. And in fact, actually, he is the one who built and was responsible for the creation of Penn Station in New York, the original beautiful Penn Station. There was even a sculpture apparently of him in the old version, which is now gone. And of course, Alexander himself became a great art collector and had lots of contacts, which Cassatt took advantage of. And then, of course, there's poor, tragic Lydia sitting at an embroidery frame, very much at work, painted very shortly before her tragic and untimely demise. But what really took off, and what really is, of course, what Cassatt is best known for today, are these wonderful paintings of mothers and children, these beautiful maternal images. Now, I want to tell you I find a very amusing anecdote that I learned when I was preparing my exhibition. In 1913, Congress was discussing a plan to establish Mother's Day as a national holiday. Mary Cassatt wrote to her friend Louisine Havemeyer, and she said, I would write to the mother of the congressman who proposed this and tell her she should box in her son's conceited ears. Cassatt was offended by the idea. She thought it was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard of. And that's not what you think. You think, Mary Cassatt, the painter of mothers and children, surely she would appreciate this. No, she had no time for all of that. She, of course, never married. She never had children of her own. She had many nieces and nephews, some of whom she would see on the occasional visit to the United States or when they came to Paris. But this was something that, as a woman, she had, one could argue, she had sort of a maternal instinct, I suppose. But again, these images are so extraordinary because they feel so real and so right. This is a subject that could very easily become too sentimental and too sweet and too precious. But again, that you get that sense that these are real children. The way the child is sort of sliding off his mother's lap, this wonderful sort of sleepy expression on his face. I mean, it feels so much like a real child. It is sort of hard to imagine that she herself did not have any children and never apparently had any interest in that. And this beautiful painting from Cincinnati. And the paint surface, again, is so, so beautiful. I mean, slides do not give any justice to this. Maybe I should show you. So again, comparing, this is not unique to Mary Cassatt, but I think even Bertha Morisot, this is a painting of her sister Edma and her daughter. The child seems rather generic. The child doesn't really have any kind of personality. It's this beautiful, angelic, Cupid doll face, but you don't get that kind of sense of a personality. And then Monet's unfinished painting, Monet had a very sort of complicated relationship with his son Jean. In fact, here's a horrifying anecdote for you. When Monet's father found out that he had gotten his mistress Camille pregnant, he basically encouraged Monet to abandon her. And fortunately, he did not. And actually, his friend Frederic Bazille went, and sort of went on his friend's behalf and encouraged him, supported. But Monet felt very ambivalent. He didn't want to be tied down. He didn't want a child. But after Jean was born, he said, he almost said, "Oh, I'm almost surprised. I actually really love him." Go figure. So this painting is sort of him reconciling himself to fatherhood. But what you can't see here, which we discovered when we did X-rays, originally the baby's mouth was open. And I said, well, there's one way to shut up the screaming child. Just paint it over and he goes at peace. But again, you don't get a sense of that kind of maternal bond that you do in wonderful paintings like there we go. There's the gold standard right there. It's such a beautiful painting. I was telling Patricia that for years, whenever preparing for this lecture, I pulled up old PowerPoints and old images, and I've used this image many times. I've never seen it in the flesh until now, and it's 1,000 times more beautiful. The paint is so, so exquisite. But look at that gesture. The child sort of reaching up and cupping his mother's chin. I mean, it's just, it's so, I don't have children, and I just feel moved by that. It's so incredibly tender in the way the child tucks its head into the crook of his mother's neck. It's just, you see that, and it's just melting in the tenderness. And again, it feels so true and so real and right and natural that you don't notice the fact that what the heck happened to that child's face? You don't focus on that. It's not important. This is what matters. This beautiful engagement, the mother looking at the child looking up at the mother, that exquisite, perfect moment of contentment and warmth. So you don't need to, all the rest sort of fades away because that's not what's really important. And of course, the paint is so beautiful and so exquisite that it all just fades away. And then this beautiful painting, this I saw in Paris when I was there, from Bilbao. Oh, so gorgeous. It's just so, again, it's wonderful. The child, clearly very tired, just sort of sleepily, sort of flopped over his mother's shoulder. We don't need to see her to know the intimacy. It communicates itself so exquisitely in this beautiful painting. Now, Cassatt moves again to her last residence in 1887 on the Rue Matignon, which is actually close to the Boulevard Haussmann, so much closer. I should say she's sort of been moving her way from Montmartre and the Place Pigalle, and getting to more central, a little more chic location, probably because of her parents. But what I love is, you can see here, where is it in the slide? I think it's right here. This little plaquette, which I will read for you. Actually, let me change my glasses because I should have written it down. Which says, Mary Cassatt, American Impressionist painter, friend and colleague of Edgar Degas. Lived in this house from 1887 to her death in 1926. Really? Really? That's what you're going to say about her? No one says, here lived Edgar Degas, friend and colleague of Mary Cassatt. No one goes to the Renoir house and says, friend of Monet. It's so incredibly frustrating to sort of see that this is still lingering. We need to work on this. We need to sort of change that, but this is the cross that Mary Cassatt continues to bear. Now, Mary Cassatt, as I mentioned, she was an incredibly dynamic, ambitious, adventurous artist, which is one of the things that I love the most about her. And in 1890, there was this extraordinary exhibition at the École des Beaux-Arts of about 300 Japanese prints. Now, Japanese prints had been making their way into France ever since 1867 under the Meiji dynasty, when Japan finally first opened its borders to the West. And Japanese art had been slowly encroaching and coming and making its way westward, and artists were just blown away. And it was amazing and revelatory and very, very exciting. So Japanese prints in and of themselves were not unique. There were dealers in Paris like Bing, and even Père Tanguy, who actually traded in Japanese prints. Artists collected them. But this was the first time there had been this sort of critical mass of prints on display. And it was an amazing moment for artists. And Mary Cassatt, I've been reading my notes. When she saw this exhibition, she wrote to her friend Berthe Morisot and extolled the beauty of the prints. And she said, I dream of it and don't think of anything else but color on copper. So for Cassatt, this was a revelation. This was an amazing moment in time for her. But again, as I said, these were not unknown. French artists had been collecting prints. There's actually a wonderful exhibition, if any of you are going to Paris, in Giverny that just opened, which is secretly the real reason I went, was to go to the opening for this exhibition, but the real reason I was going to see Cassatt. So don't tell my bosses, I don't want to get in trouble for that. They wouldn't mind. But in the exhibition, they included all these wonderful prints that belonged to actual Impressionist artists. So Monet, Edgar Degas, and also Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt owned a number of Japanese prints. We don't know when exactly she acquired them. So this could have been after 1890, it could have been before. But she really loved the prints, particularly of Utamaro, these images of women's lives, and sort of these very intimate scenes of domestic interiors and mothers and children. And so for her, this energized her. And so it inspired her to undertake one of the most extraordinary print campaigns ever done in France, a series of color prints that are essentially a westernized version of the Japanese woodblock print. They weren't executed on woodblock, but instead copper plates, multiple plates using color. Nothing like this had ever been undertaken by anyone. And I'm not talking any woman, I'm talking any artist had done anything like this. This series of prints, which is now known as the 10, I mean, that's how important and significant they really are, was an extraordinary technical achievement. I mean, it was incredibly complicated. She worked with a professional printmaker to help her with the actual printing, because in printmaking, one of the biggest challenges, and if anyone has done printmaking, you know this, is registration. Essentially lining everything up precisely so that everything is where it should be, so that you don't have like the woman's hair on the other side of the head, something floating out in the middle of nowhere. So there's a lot of technical challenges, a lot of work and preparation. Each of these prints, and sadly, you can't really see it, these are all inscribed by hand by Cassatt. She did an edition of 25 of these prints. So that this is a very important series. There's 10 of them. The first she did in the series is the bath. And you can see how really wonderful how they play, going back to Japanese print, the beautiful line of the etching that you see in the hair, for example, and the beautiful outlining, but at the same time, the wonderful color and beautiful play of pattern. I mean, they're very, as I said, if you haven't done printmaking, it's very hard to understand just how incredibly difficult it is, the precision that's required, the thought and preparation to get everything just so. This is an amazing undertaking on her part. And they are extraordinarily beautiful prints. They are, as I said, one of the great achievements when people talk about what are the great printmaking endeavors of the 19th century. They talk about, Goya's Los Caprichos. They talk about Gauguin's Noa Noa, and Daumier's great lithographs, and the 10. I mean, this is one of those sort of moments that really revolutionized printmaking forever, thanks to what she did. And these were extraordinarily successful and greatly admired. In fact, in 1893, as I mentioned, November 1893, she gets her first one-woman exhibition at the Galerie de Renoir. She has an exhibit of 98 works, and it included the 10. Because here's a funny little thing. There was an artist group known as the Society of French Printmakers, and they had an annual exhibition, but it was French printmakers. So Mary Cassatt, who was not French, and also Camille Pissarro, who was not French, he actually was born in the Danish Antilles, were both shut out, which was bad form, very bad form. However, she did get to finally exhibit these prints in her one-woman show. And Pissarro, who saw the exhibition, wrote to his son that, at this moment, Miss Cassatt has a very impressive show at Durand Ruel's. She is really very able. There's an exclamation mark, so that should give you a sense. I mean, it sounds like damning with faint praise, but for Pissarro, that she is able, that capability, that talent is really important. And these are, again, such extraordinary prints, and now very, very, very coveted, frequently requested for exhibitions. Also in line with this sort of bold, adventurous spirit, in 1892, Mary Cassatt was approached to produce a mural for the Women's Building at the Chicago Columbian Exposition. Bertha Palmer, who was the president of the board of lady managers of the fair, I love that. It was funny, previous fairs, the women did all the fundraising, they did all the heavy lifting, but they didn't actually get to have any control over the art. So when 1893 came around, the women said, you know what, if we're doing all that fundraising, we want a share of the pie. So they basically had the Women's Building. And so Bertha Palmer was in charge of this, but she didn't initially want Mary Cassatt. She didn't invite her, partly because she knew who she was to a certain extent, because Bertha Palmer was collecting Impressionist art and Mary Cassatt was a very big figure in that. But she wasn't entirely sure. She wanted actually Elizabeth Gardner. Now, Elizabeth Gardner, you probably don't necessarily know, was an American artist who went to Paris and then went on to marry Adolphe Bouguereau. And you can see one of his paintings upstairs. But she was, by that time, 55 years old, and this was a pretty big undertaking, and she didn't want to do that. But fortunately, Sarah Hallowell, who was an American art dealer, who was the assistant chief of fine arts for the fine arts department for the fair, knew Cassatt's work very well, and she's the one who told Bertha Palmer, Mary Cassatt, she's the one you want. So Mary Cassatt and Mary MacMonies were each basically commissioned to paint a mural. For Cassatt's mural, her subject is basically young women picking fruit from the tree of knowledge. It was a huge mural, and its height is 13 feet high and a total of 58 feet wide. So this was a huge undertaking. Initially, when Cassatt was approached by this, she was reluctant. In fact, she said that she was sort of appalled by the idea. But the more she thought of it, the more intrigued she was to sort of try something she'd never done before. The challenge of it was kind of appealing. But the best part, and I think what really sort of made her decide to do it, was the bare idea of such a thing put Degas into a rage. So she basically did it to spite Degas, because he was like saying all kinds of terrible things, and the more he did, she said, it got my spirits up. And so she decides to take on this challenge. And sadly, the mural was not well received, unfortunately. It no longer exists. It was destroyed. I know, it's very sad. But we do have photographs of it. What's interesting is obviously it's an allegorical subject. It's women picking fruit from the tree of knowledge. It's about the cultivation of young minds and women sort of reaching up and aspiring and becoming more. But what she does that's so interesting is, unlike Mary MacMonnies, who did another allegorical subject, these are modern women. They're in modern dress. These are not allegorical figures drawn from classical antiquity. They are real women, which was probably what sort of put off a lot of people, because allegories were supposed to be distant and aloof, and Mary Cassatt made it a little too real. But clearly this wasn't coming out of nowhere for her. She did a number of beautiful paintings. I'm showing you two of them on the left, the women plucking fruit from 1892, and then this really beautiful baby picking an apple. The painting, in fact, on the left was one of the works shown in 1893 at the Durand-Ruel Gallery. And Degas, that's when Degas reputedly remarked that no woman had a right to draw like that, which was his sort of backhanded way of saying, oh, that's really good. She knew that coming from Degas, that was high praise from the typically taciturn Degas. We do actually have, for example, a beautiful study that she did for this painting, but she clearly, drew inspiration from this. And in the next series of color prints, one of them is The Gathering Fruit from 1893, the second series after the 10. So the iconography clearly appealed to her. But you can see there's definitely a change in her style as her art becomes more mature. As she enters sort of this last phase of her career, the figures become more monumental, more weighty, much more like classical sculpture and classical art. And this is particularly true in all of the art she's producing. Just as sort of an aside, one of my favorite paintings, The Boating Party, that she painted actually during a winter trip to Antibes. She and her mother oftentimes went to Antibes and Mediterranean in the summertime. This was done in the winter of 1893 to 1894. And so she really plays up that incredibly intense southern light. The light is so incredibly brilliant and intense, it eradicates midtones, so everything becomes very sharp. The colors become very intense, and she plays it up with these sort of this citron green and this wonderful bold blue, and tilting up of the space. It's Japanese art once again, but played out in painting. And clearly she is being very much inspired by Manet's painting of boating, a painting that she had actually described in 1879 to her friend Louisine Havemeyer as the last word in painting. And in fact, she ultimately encouraged Louisine Havemeyer to buy this painting, which she did in 1895, and is now in the Met. But this is sort of Cassatt's own sort of riff. This might have been the latest thing in painting in 1874 when he painted it, but 20 years later, she is now the last word in painting. And once again, this play between media, wonderful painting of summer, of girls in a boat, which she then also plays out in a print. Sort of, once again, this wonderful dialogue she has going on, trying and experimenting. And just, it makes for an interesting comparison when you look at what Bertha Morisot, her treatment of that subject, is much more about color, but it's very vague. Cassatt's feels much more physical. She maintains that sort of physicality, and it's particularly true in the painting she's doing her last years. In 1894, she also purchases a chateau, as one does, the Chateau Beaufresne, which is outside of Beauvais, which is, she still retains her apartment in Paris, but she's spending most of her time in the countryside. And in fact, she built, you can't barely see it, this sort of glass encased, this is her studio, where she had beautiful light, she could paint at will. And so she's basically spending most of her time in the countryside at this point. And she is focusing once again on paintings of mothers and children. But again, as I was saying, that sense of monumentality, of weightiness, of physicality, how different this is from the Wichita painting. You can sort of see this is an entirely new phase in her career. She's sort of shifting back to her roots in the old masters, the paintings she had seen in Parma and the Louvre and Rome and Madrid. And they're wonderfully, again, beautiful, sort of whimsical images. The children are more oftentimes not infants in arms, but slightly older children who engage us. It's a wonderful sense of their presence. The painting on the right of the mother and child, the oval mirror, is a very amusing painting. Degas talking about this, could clearly see Renaissance art running through this painting, and rather waspishly commented that this painting has all of your qualities and all of your faults. It's the infant Jesus and his English nurse. You can see why Degas in small doses. But he, you know, I don't agree with the faults, but he's absolutely right about the Renaissance underpinnings. The Havemeyers who bought this painting called it their Florentine Madonna. And that's exactly right, because that is where she is, that's what she's referencing in these paintings in particular. More than the earlier paintings, it is Raphael, it is Titian, it is these great Renaissance Madonna and child paintings that give a kind of weight and solemnity that she didn't have in her earlier paintings. And how different when you consider the oval portrait from what her contemporaries are doing. I'm showing you, these are two American women artists, Elizabeth Nourse on the left, this very realistic painting, but focused too much on the details. It's less about the figures and more about the entire environment. And that's even more true in Cecilia Beau's The Last Days of Childhood, where the setting sort of almost overtakes the figures. For Cassatt, it never does. The figures remain front and center, and keeping with that Florentine Madonna, you even have, you know, a real-life modern halo around the child. Again, this is very intentional. She's doing this, you know, very willfully. And then, of course, again, beautiful pastels. I mean, I could talk for days and days about these exquisite pastels that she does, the wonderful skill she has as she brings to these objects, the immediacy of pastel, the freshness and vitality of these works, which are so extraordinary. And again, that wonderful sense of the immediacy of the moment. Here you have a mother playing with a child, and that wonderful sense of connection that you get between them. She also undertook a wonderful series late in her late career of children, these beautiful portraits. Margot, in particular, was a local girl who lived near Beaufresne, who was the daughter of a local, and frequently posed with these wonderful hats. I mean, these fabulous hats that Margot is always wearing in paintings and in pastels. And they're just such lovely, charming images of childhood. Sadly for Mary Cassatt, her latter years were difficult. By 1911, her health had started to decline. She was diagnosed with diabetes, rheumatism, neurology, and cataracts. She kept working, but by 1914, she essentially was forced to give up art entirely because she'd become almost blind, which is really tragic. The one thing that she did focus on in her last years was the cause of women's suffrage. She was a great devotee, believed firmly that women should have the right. In fact, she ended up having a pretty significant falling out with her sisters-in-law and her nieces, who were women who were very comfortable, and they didn't really believe that women should have the vote. And Mary Cassatt was angered by this and said, if you don't want to vote, that's fine, but you have no right to deny other women. So works of art that she had planned to give to her family, she did not. One of them, in fact, is The Boating Party, which is now in the National Gallery collection. So I'm not entirely disappointed by that falling out, but Mary Cassatt was not someone who compromised. Not in her art, not in her life. She was not an easy person. She was a very difficult person, but she knew her mind, and she stuck by her guns, whatever she did. And so when her friend Louisine Havemeyer in 1915 decided to mount an exhibition in New York for the cause of suffrage, Mary Cassatt was game to participate. She was not in New York at the time, but she sent some work. And what's interesting about this exhibition, it was mostly from private collections in New York, mostly Louisine Havemeyer's great collection. And there were a few old masterworks, but the majority was one giant room, half of which was Mary Cassatt and half was Edgar Degas. And Degas knew nothing about this, which is probably just as well. I'm not sure he would have been so keen. And Cassatt herself said she had mixed feelings about, exhibiting. This is the first time they'd been seen in an exhibition together since 1886, the last Impressionist show. So she had definite mixed feelings about that 30 years on, but it was an important moment. The exhibition did not do terribly well, sadly, because, still women's suffrage, women voting. A lot of people were very unnerved, particularly a woman of Louisine Havemeyer's social standing. I mean, to be such a social activist was really wonderful, but Cassatt believed very firmly in this. Sadly, she continued on for 11 more years, and then in 1926, she passed away. Her health finally gave out, and she is buried in the family vault in Ménil-Theribus in France. And you can see there's Mary Cassatt, and also her parents, her sister Lydia, and also her youngest brother, actually Gardner, who died in 1855 before the family was in Paris. So they're all interred in France. So Mary Cassatt may not yet have her reputation fully ensconced in France, but she remains literally embedded in France. So the time is coming, it's starting, but until that time, until the French fully recognize the wonder that is Mary Cassatt, we here in the United States recognize her and applaud her. So thank you.